Let's make a QuickTime event system. If I go into here, I have to press a certain button within a certain amount of time, otherwise it says a failure. And if I do, it says success. And of course, we can hook that up to any arbitrary code that we want. This system will make use of the enhanced input system, and we'll get into all the nitty-gritty details in a moment. The finished project file, as you see right here, will be available for download for YouTube members and Patreons, as always. Now, let's get into the actual tutorial. With an entirely new empty project, we're going to have to do a little bit of setup as we get started. We're going to set up a couple of input actions, but even before that, I'm going to go ahead and make a blueprints enum. And this will be our QuickTime inputs, because we're going to be making a input action for each possible input type that we have for our QuickTime event. We want to have an enum to easily be able to pick between those. So we're going to add stuff like face button top, face button bottom, and of course face button left and right as well. And you can expand this to also use the D-pad and maybe like the shoulder buttons and whatever else. And this might seem initially like it's maybe a little bit hard-coded in a lot of ways, but a controller only has so many buttons that realistically are going to be used for QuickTime events. And with the enhanced input system, the keyboard bindings you can make rebindable if you want to. So this way we can map these to input actions, and then what those input actions are bound to is entirely like rebindable if you would want it to be. For now though, we're going to stick with just these four because everything else would just be replication of effort. And then we're going to go into third person, inputs, actions, and I'm going to make some new input actions. So for those, I like to just look up input actions because I can never remember where they actually are. And we'll call this QTE face stop. And just to show you, there's nothing you need to do inside of the input action. It doesn't need to trigger when paused, unless there's a very specific reason for your game that it does need to do that. It's just a value type bool. It doesn't need any specific triggers or modifiers. Again, unless you yourself want to enable it to use certain triggers or have certain modifiers working for it. But for the most part, you can just leave it at these default values. And then we make one for the face top, we make one for the bottom, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm also going to be importing the images here that I made. These will be included in the project files as well if you go ahead and take the download, because we're going to be displaying these on the widgets for the QuickTime event. Talking about which, let's make that. So we make a new user interface widget blueprint, which will be a user widgets, and we'll call this WBP QTE for QuickTime event. And here we just set up the QuickTime event widgets, which in my case, I'm going to use a size box for. When using a size box, I like to set this to being desired. And then we set the width override and height to something like 150 and 80, I believe, is the numbers that I personally use. These are going to be adjustable in a moment anyway. In that size box, we're going to put a vertical box, because we're going to be stacking two other things on top of each other. The first of which will be an image. So drag and drop in an image. The image will be center aligned. You can do it for both or just for the horizontal alignment. It doesn't really matter. I like to do it for both. And then we'll have a progress bar, because we need to have something ticking down, showing us how much time we have left to like deal with this QuickTime event. And that one, we're going to set the size to being fill. And then the padding, I like to set that to like 10. And then maybe the top padding here, I will set to 5, just so that this distance is a little bit smaller. And then the image itself, if we go into brush, I'm going to go into image size, and I'm going to set this to like 50 units, so that the progress bar is not like super huge. And that's all that we have to do in the designer. For future use, we're going to set this size box to being variable. It's not going to be relevant right now, but when we actually go in and make like an actor to trigger the QuickTime events, we're going to set the size box's dimensions, for which it is going to need to be accessible as a variable. But for now, let's go get the event graph open and start coding up our functionality. The very first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go an event pre-construct. We'll take our image and we will set its brush from a texture, because we want to set it to one of these 4 images. Or again, maybe you have a D-pad image as well, shoulder button images, start, select images, whatever you want. So we pull this and we add a selecting node, and we're going to be selecting based on the enum that we made. We made this enum with all the potential options for our QuickTime inputs. So we'll make a variable for that. That will be our QTE input, and that will be of type QuickTime Events input, the enum that we just made. We'll set that to being exposed and exposed on spawn, so that when we make this widget, we can give in the value of what type of QuickTime events that we're working with here, and then we can just drag that into the index here, and that will change the select node to represent all the possible options for our enum. So now we simply just set the top image to the top and the bottom to the bottom, and well, just everything to match up like this. You can also just drag and drop them. I always forget that that is a thing that you can do. So that will display the proper image on our widgets. Now on event construct, we're going to set up a timer because it's a QuickTime event, so we need to be quick in time for the event, for which we're going to need to set up a timer. So what we'll do is we'll make a variable, which will be the end time. That's the time that we have to do this before. This will make more sense in a moment, hopefully. And that'll be of type float. And we will set that on event construct to being our get game time in seconds. And to that, we will add the amount of time that we have to react to this, which will be also a variable. So let's call this time to react. Time to react, we're also going to expose and expose on spawn, because we're going to be wanting to set this every time we spawn in one of these widgets. So we get our current game time plus our time to react. That's going to be the absolute latest time that we're allowed to react to this widget. If we reach that time without any input having happened, obviously that means that we have failed the QuickTime event. So we can very easily do that by just adding in a delay, and we're going to be delaying for the time to react. So if this is 1 second, we're going to be delaying for 1 second. If it's 5, we'll delay for 5, and so on and so forth. Then that will go into a gate. And the reason we go into a gate here is because even if we remove this widget from the screen, it's technically still going to exist and be running its code for a little while longer. That's because when you remove a widget, it doesn't actually destroy the object, it just stops displaying it. And then when it's no longer being referenced by anything, Unreal's garbage collection takes care of it. But that only happens every so often. So what we don't want to have happen is the code that we're going to set up in a moment that actually deals with successfully finishing the QuickTime event with a correct button press, and then still having this delay node trigger. So we're going to close this gate when we actually successfully trigger the QuickTime event. But if we go through this gate and it is not closed, so it should also not start as closed, by the way, we will call out a event dispatcher that we need to make. So we'll make it an event dispatcher and call that finished QTE, and that will have one input, and we'll call that input success, and it will be of type bool. So if we go through this gate, we call this with a success value of none, so false, because we failed the QuickTime events. Now, let's put event tick to the side because we're going to be using that in a moment. Now we get to the fun bit, because we can make our QTE input events right on this widget. So I'm going to add all 4 of my input events. Again, if you have more than just these 4, you'll add all of them in here. And we're going to be expanding these to use the started bin for all of them. Now, for all of these, they'll always trigger no matter which kind of input event that we're expecting. We have this enum here that's saying, hey, we're expecting this QuickTime event to be responding to, for instance, the top button. But the left, right, and bottom button also will still fire their events. So for each one of these, what we're going to need to do is we need to put in a branch at the start. And then the condition, we will need to check if the QuickTime input is equal. And pay attention here, you need to take the equal enum, not just the equal normal operator, because that way you get this nice little drop-down menu. And we need to check, hey, is the QuickTime input that we're looking for, is that the same as the event that is firing here? In this case, is that the bottom? Because this will just gate off everything that we're not actually looking for. So we'll do that for every single one of these events, and then change it to the corresponding expected input event. And for all of these, they are going to hook up to a QTE finished with a value of success true. only when the branch condition is true. If it's false, it's just going to do nothing, which means if we're looking for a face button bottom, but face button left is the thing being pressed, we're going to be checking, hey, is input events equal to left? No, it's not, because it's equal to bottom. So this is going to be false, so it's going to be doing nothing. That way it will only actually execute this with the event that's corresponding to the enum value that we gave this. So we hook all 4 of those up with the true, and then after we call out the QTE finished with success, we also hook this up to the closed pin on the gate, because again, if we finish this successfully, we want to make sure that it doesn't also send out a signal a couple of seconds later that it failed, because it might do that due to the fact of how widgets work in Unreal Engine. Now the only thing that we really have left to do is make our progress bar. So we pull in our progress bar here, and this is really easy to set up actually, because all we need to do here is we need to set the percentage. And the way we're going to be calculating our percentage is using the get game times in second again. And we'll also use our end time. We're going to do end time minus the current game time. And the result of that, we're going to be dividing by the amount of time we have to react. And that's going to give us a simple taking down from 1 to 0 value, which is exactly what the set percent node takes in. So now we have a taking down progress bar. And that's all the code for the widget, really. So let's make an actor that can now use this so that we can show you how to actually implement it and work with it. But this widget you can put into about everything you want. You can make entire actors that only have the functionality of using Quicktime Events and then running one code or the other. But you can implement this within like a gameplay ability as well if you're using the gameplay ability system, which makes your moment-to-moment gameplay and maybe like combat a little bit more interesting, that kind of stuff. So let's make a quick actor here. We'll call this just a normal actor. We'll call this QTE trigger. And here I'm just going to be adding a quick little box collision. For now, I'm going to set this to not be hidden in game so that I can actually see it in the gameplay. And we'll also add a widget component. For the widget component, we're going to set the space to being screen space, so that it's always properly like facing the camera and visible. And aside from that, nothing else much will change. We'll set the draw size to whatever we want. I think I set it to 150 and 80 before. But this is where we can now set this to being effectively whatever we want. If we want it to be bigger, we can set it to like 300 and 160. Or we can even set it to being a different aspect ratio. We can set this to be like 90 instead, so it'll be a lot wider but not that much taller. And you can set the draw size to whatever you want here. I'm gonna stick with 150 and 80 for now though. Here on begin overlap in the event graph, we're going to check if the thing that we're overlapping with is the get player character, just to make sure that it doesn't trigger when there's like an enemy that walks through it or something like that, right? And we actually need to check another thing as well. We are going to make a variable called isActive, because if there's already a QuickTime event happening on this thing, we don't want to spawn in another one, because that is going to be confusing for the player and also going to be confusing for the code itself. So we want to check is active, do a not boolean, and then we're going to do an and boolean, so that we're going to be checking both of these conditions. So if we're overlapping with the player character and this object is not currently actively working with a QuickTime event, then we move on. And when we move on, we will create a widget. And the widget that we'll create, to nobody's surprise, will be a QTE. I keep misspelling it with a W, I don't know why. And that has our QTE input type and our time to react. So let's promote both of those to variables as well, obviously. So that'll be QTE input. We'll expose that so that we can make it editable on a per instance basis. Same with the time to react, will be a instance editable variable. Then we'll take our widget component from our components here, and there we can set the widget to the widget that we just created. So this component is now going to be displaying the QTE widget that we made. I also like to personally then promote this to a variable so that it's just a little easier to interact with. So we'll call this screen QTE or something like that. It's not entirely necessary because you can get it from the widget component moving forward, but I like having it as a separate variable. And with that, we're going to bind to our finished QTE. So that'll bind an event that we need to make. So let's make a custom event, which will have the corresponding parameters with it as well. I'm just going to keep calling this like custom event or like finished QTE. You can call this whatever you want. And then we set is active to being true, because now we have an active QTE going on. So if you overlap with it again, we don't want to do anything until this QTE is finished. And then for the sake of having no conflicts between this draw size and the size box size here, what I like to do is then use that variable that we just made, screen QTE, get the size box, and set the height override, and set the width override based on this widget's get draw size, which will split open. And then the height will be the Y and the width will be the X. You can obviously do this the other way around as well, where you set the draw size on the widget based on the height and width override from your size box. It's just nice to have these being at the same value, so that there's no like weird conflict where they're expecting like different sizes or different aspect ratios or whatever, which might end up with like squeezing and squashing your image in weird ways. Now, let's go to the event that we made when we finished the QTE, because here we need to check, first and foremost, set is active back to false, because when it's finished, it's clearly no longer active and we need to be able to like re-trigger it again for the next one. Then we can use our QTE screen variable that we made, and there we can unbind all events from finished QTE. You might want to just specifically unbind this event. If you're coding up something that externally also binds to this, that might still need to use it. But honestly, if you're finishing the Quicktime event, there's probably no reason that anything should be bound to this anymore. So just unbinding everything, make sure that there's no double firing that's weird while this thing is pending garbage collection. Then we'll use our widgets set widgets for the widget component again. And this time we'll just set the widget to nothing. Then we'll remove it from the screen. And then if we also set our screen QTE variable to nothing, now nothing in the game is referencing the widget that we created anymore, which clears it for being garbage collected, which will destroy it eventually at the next garbage collection cycle. All of this needs to happen regardless of whether or not the QTE was successful. So after all that, we set a branch and we connect it up to the success pin. Because if it was successful, we do like one thing, and if it was not successful, we do something entirely different. This is entirely up to what you want to do. You can make two separate event dispatches on this that call out that other things can like bind to on whether or not like something, maybe a door should open up or whatever, or you can just write out the code itself. And here, for now, we're just going to do a print string for success. And I'll make that like a nice little green color. And I will do one for failure as well, which will be a very aggressive red color, just to show you how all of that works. So now the last thing to do is to set up our input bindings, which is relatively straightforward. We can go into our inputs, into our input bindings, and then just bind all of our input events that we have. So QTE bottom, left, right, and top. You kind of get that ID, I'm sure. And then you just bind these to whatever keys you want. So in my case, I'm going to bind these to the K, J, L, and I keys for the keyboard. Again, you can make these read bindable if you want to. I really should make a video on that maybe at some point. But you can bind other things to it as well. So this will be the face button up bottom. So they will respond to multiple different types of inputs. So face button left for the next one. And that's why the enhanced input system is so nice, because you can very easily set up all of these different like input actions and make them relatively adjustable. So now that we have all of that going on, let's put one of our QTE triggers into the world. Let's set the time to react to 4 seconds. And then the button that we're looking for will be the left button, let's say. So if we now go through it, we can see it spawns in that widget, takes about 4 seconds, and then it says failure. But if I press the proper button, it says success, and it immediately disappears as well. You can even have multiple different ones going at the same time. Of course, they will all respond to your input. So if I have all of them set to left, they will all disappear at the same time. In which case you might want to like set up a system where in the widgets you also have like a bool for is focused or something like that. And you want to check on all of those as well. So only like do any of this is if focus is true. And then have some code on the player that only focuses on the closest QuickTime event trigger or whatever. That is kind of similar to the targeting system tutorial that I have. So you might want to check that out if that interests you. But for now, this should do. And we can, of course, set these to different buttons very easily so that they all have their own inputs that they respond to. And just like that, I have all of these like different input QuickTime events. So if you want this project file, there's a link down below in the description, as I've said like 3 times already, so I'm not going to bother you too much with it. Next time, we'll be back with some more fun stuff to develop. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. And of course, an extra massive thank you to my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas, and my Cave Student tier supporters, Oiku and Earl Monsville Urno.